Hello, my name's Adam Ferry. I'm an occupational therapist and one of the directors of the Occupational Therapy Service. The purpose of this video is to explore concepts that maximise accessible kitchen space for someone with a wheelchair user, whether that's a full-time wheelchair user or a part-time wheelchair user. Now, in our experience, the kitchen is one of the most under-recommended or under-considered spaces in accessible design. On reflection, that might be because it's not seen necessarily as something that's critical, whereas a bathroom space might be. Now, whilst I accept that a bathroom space is absolutely critical, think about the skills that we learn or how productive we are in a kitchen space, how important that is to family or individual routines and roles. For a child in the kitchen, how much do we learn? How much do we teach the child in that kitchen space that stands them in good stead for the rest of their lives? And for the adult who's the wheelchair user, how important is that as part of their daily routines, their independence, their role as parent, or any other role that they may consider important within that space? Some of the key concepts within kitchen design are layout, circulation space, worktops, appliances, and others that we'll go through in a little more depth. From a layout perspective, kitchens tend to be one of either one-sided, two-sided, L-shaped, or U-shaped. And it's very difficult sometimes, unless we're supporting a big rebuild or a big redesign, for us to change that layout necessarily. So it's about thinking with the layout we have, how best can that space be used. If you've got a one or two-sided kitchen, what we want to really do is create a design that supports that linear movement, whether the person can access and egress from one side and the other, so they're going straight through the kitchen. Or with the other designs, whether it be L or U-shaped, how we're maximising the circulation space within that to enable the person to turn and exit in the way that they've entered the kitchen. And whilst that's not always entirely in our gift, those concepts are important for us to consider. But that leads nicely into circulation spaces. So we need to be looking to create a minimum of 1500 by 1500 mil circulation space. Sometimes, if your experience is like mine, we'll go into kitchens and we think that just isn't possible. It could be a small galley kitchen, you think, how do I achieve that? Firstly, it's important to think about recess and depth of that recess. So AKW's kitchens design have an extra deep recess, deeper than most others on the market. And that recess can be included within that circulation space because it allows the feet and foot plates to go underneath the cupboards and drawers. It increases the flexibility you have over those turning circles. But maximising it as much as possible is the important thing. What we're suggesting is a minimum of 1500 by 1500, and that is that's included in DocM guides, so we're using that as our evidence base. Worktops are incredibly important, not just what worktops, but the height of those worktops and where the recesses are. So again, those extra high and extra deep recesses allow a wheelchair user to get close to those worktops so that they're not having to lean in and away from their body with a big gap between themselves and the workbench. It could be like that's something like the active motion worktop allows flexibility within the household for the wheelchair user, where there are other users of the kitchen, where that can be used to allow the person to get their wheelchair underneath the workspace whilst also accessing the space. And it can be raised for the person who sometimes uses the wheelchair and is sometimes ambulant, or for another member of the household. Within a wheelchair accessible kitchen space, take time to consider appliances such as the hob and the oven, which we'll cover in a little bit more depth shortly, as well as access to cupboards, again, whether they are pull down or active motion, so that the wheelchair user can access spaces that might be otherwise unaccessible. All of these things are concepts that we're introducing that you can find out about in much more depth from the Wheelchair Accessible Design Guide on the AKW website. One of the things we encourage people to consider when designing wheelchair accessible kitchens is induction hobs, because it only heats where it's needed and it cools very quickly. And also take consideration to where the dials and controls are. Often you'll see these on the side of an induction hob or any other kind of hob, and what that encourages is the person to lean over hot surfaces. Dials at the front remove that risk completely. It allows the person to control heat and temperature without having to lean over what might otherwise be hot surfaces. We encourage ovens to be installed at the right height within full units to allow the best access for the wheelchair user. We recommend hide and slide or side opening ovens. In this instance, I think we've got a perfect setup. We've got hide and slide oven, so the oven door is tucked away nicely. We recommend within the oven there is at least one fully retractable shelf, so that the wheelchair user can get very close to what's hot on it, and alongside it, heat resistant shelving, so the wheelchair user can take what's hot and immediately put it down onto heat resistant shelving and then move to wherever they need to be to deal with that. So that reduces the risk of scalding, burning, and puts the person in a really good postural position. What else you'll see from this position is that because of the height and extra depth of the recess, the person is able to get as close to those appliances as possible. If the recess weren't as deep, they may be in this position and still needing to lean into the heat, which makes, from a postural perspective, it more effortful to then put it down onto a heat resistant surface. So the combination of those concepts creates a space that the wheelchair user is able to function in independently and safely. The current wheelchair positioning gives a really good example of what we're talking about with recess, and how the recess is used to create the minimum 1500 by 1500 mil turning circle. You can see from the angle there, because of the extra depth that AKW are able to create with the recess and the height from those units, that the person's feet are able to get right under the unit, putting them in a great position to be able to function. It also means that the measurement of our 1500 by 1500 starts at that recess rather than where it might otherwise be, which would be at the cupboard depth. So this recess, which AKW offer the extra depth for the wheelchair user, maximizes turning circle and increases accessibility. Another key consideration in designing an accessible space for somebody who is a wheelchair user are sockets and switches. Now, standard switches such as light switches, the recommendation is that they are no more than 900 millimeters from the finished floor surface, and other isolating switches such as a shower stopcock are around 1000 millimeters from the finished floor surface. And something like the shower stopcock is a really important thing to consider. Imagine a wheelchair user in this environment and a pipe bursts, for example. How is that person going to get into the back of a cupboard to use a traditional stopcock? Something like the shower stop, which, like I've said, as an isolating switch should be 1000 millimeters from the finished floor surface, can be easily activated, turned on and off to allow the wheelchair user to isolate the water in that space. It's certainly something that I integrate into every design where there is water present, so particularly the bathroom and the kitchen, and is another example of how a space can be made even more accessible. Accessible kitchen designs are increasingly innovative. For example, in this kitchen it includes a pull-out ironing board where the wheelchair user within the same space can pull it out of a drawer, complete the functional task and put it away with ease, ensuring that the space is used efficiently, effectively, and the wheelchair user is able to maintain independence in all the tasks that they deem important and meaningful to them. We've mentioned active motion a few times as part of a good accessible kitchen, and active motion is really good when something needs to be variable rather than fixed height. So where there may be multiple users in the space or in the household, and things can be adjusted to meet the needs of each individual. However, if you don't need active motion, so primarily because the person is the only person using that space, the worktops can be fixed, and it's then about making sure that cupboardry is accessible at the right height. So again, if you're not going to use active motion, you can use the drop-down baskets where they're easily pulled down from that sitting position or standing position if the person's ambulant at times. They can access everything that they need to within the cupboard and then simply fold it back away. So lots of options to make sure that the kitchen is truly accessible.